Hi, and welcome to the Deer IQ podcast, where smart hunting begins. I'm Adam Lewis, and we're actually wrapping up our series on mature buck mindsets. And in this episode, we're looking at 3 ways a big buck slayer's brain is different than most, and how you can learn about that and leverage that to up your game. And we're going to dig into some neuroscience on this one that hasn't really been talked about before in the realm of deer hunting. So you're going to want to take some really good notes to get this down and how it really applies to helping you. And stay to the end because I have 2 giveaways that are going to help you change your brain and make it more like a big buck slayer's brain that'll definitely give you more success when you start thinking and acting in those ways. So here are the top things to look for during this episode. Regarding brain science, where are all the decisions made and critical thinking happening in the brain? What is automaticity, and how is this both a good and bad thing when it comes to deer hunting and application of brain science? What is the basal ganglia's role in our behaviors, and how must we leverage this to be more consistent hunters? And what are 3 ways big buck slayers use their brains differently that we can leverage to change our brain and start thinking and acting like them, getting habits like them, to then get success like them? And there's a whole lot more stuff in there as usual, so let's get to the podcast and up your deer IQ. Okay, so to begin, I have to emphasize I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a brain surgeon or anything like that, but this basics about brain science, you can look up, you can research, you can find out these basics, and what we're going to do is apply that to deer hunting. But first, what we need to do is just go over the basics and really how important this is to understanding, how we operate and how we can improve as a hunter, and really how that plays into deer hunting. It's really interesting. So first of all, we're going to start with the basics over just general brain science. Then we're going to go to examples of how this works in different situations, and then in hunting situations. And then we're going to look at, okay, how is a person that's really consistent, what I call the big buck slayer, that, everybody wants to be real consistent on taking mature bucks, and this whole series was about that. So how is their brain operating differently than just, us common guys, right? And once we learn that, the takeaways are, well, how can we incorporate that and start rewiring our brain to think similarly? Because if we can do that, we will start getting more results like them, or similar results to these better hunters. So that's what we're looking at. So here's the basics of brain science. So first of all, the goal of the brain is to actually not think. The goal of the brain is to actually conserve energy, be efficient, and not utilize too much of that thought process, which it takes the most energy out of the body. So the brain is automatically set up to not critically think as often as possible. And the brain uses roughly about 20% of the energy that we take in. The brain uses it. So it's constantly trying to figure out ways to not use energy and to not, think too hard. That's important to know. How does our brain do this? It does this through a process called automaticity. And this is basically like autopilot for our brains. And we've all been there where we realize we're doing stuff and we don't even realize what we're doing or how we're doing it. That's autopilot. And these are habits that are ingrained. These are unconscious behaviors that we have learned and taken from conscious to unconscious. Okay. Some basic examples like this, we could find them everywhere, like how to use the microwave. First time you did it, you had to be taught. You had to figure out the buttons and all that. Now it's just, you just do it, right? It's automatic. How you get to work, right? The first time you might need to look at maps or whatever, going to a new place. Pretty soon you can get there and then realize what happened to the last half hour. You were on autopilot. Your unconscious mind was just doing this out of habit and making the turns and doing all this stuff. And there's a ton of examples. Steps to bake a cake. Shooting a bow or gun. The first times you did that, you really had to think about it. You really had to be conscious about the steps you're taking and the things you're doing to perform that task. But after a while, it's just automatic. I just shoot my bow. I just shoot the gun. I'm not thinking about how I do all these steps that are involved in that. Driving a car, tying your shoe, all these things become unconscious habits and behaviors. And for the brain, that's a good thing because we don't want to be thinking real hard about every single thing we do because, again, it's a waste of energy. And when you are really engaging your brain, it really does zap the energy out of you. So that's just how the brain is wired. And it's important to remember that when we start applying it to hunting situations, okay? And those things, you think about a new way of thinking or a new task you're learning. At first, those are hard work because you're engaging the conscious thought. But over time, those turn into those unconscious habits. They're just way, way easier. And so that's what the brain is trying to do all the time. Now, if you look at parts of the brain, just basic parts, the frontal lobe, which is in the front, is responsible for the critical thinking, the reasoning, and decision making that we do. That's the conscious part, right? And we use that on average about 5% of the time. So we don't critically think that often. The rest is pushed back to these habits and unconscious just things we go through. And that's in the, we might call it the middle brain, the basal ganglia, right? This is where unconscious behavior takes place. This is where habits are created and stored. This is where automaticity or autopilot basically takes over. That's the basal ganglia, you might call it midbrain, just for ease of, just saying this. So that is about 95% of an adult's behaviors. Now, as a child, it's really interesting. As a child, you might have noticed that time passed much slower. And as you get older, time just speeds up. And there's some speculation that is just because of this behavior. When you're a child and everything is brand new to you, you are having to engage your frontal lobe and think consciously about everything that's going on and everything you're doing. As we get older, more and more that becomes automatic, the autopilot of midbrain. And so we start just going through the motions of sorts, and all this stuff is just automatic. And that causes time to just kind of pass. So that's an interesting way to look at it and kind of example of that. But that's the two things going on. Frontal lobe is where the critical thinking and decisions take place. And then midbrain, that basal ganglia, that's where these habits are created and really stored. And that's what's working as we just do this automatic autopilot type behaviors. And that's designed to make life easier. It's much easier to not have to think hard all the time, endlessly about simple tasks, right? Like tying your shoe, or again, back to shooting a bow or gun. When we're not conscious about creating the habits, okay, when we the tendency and the default is for midbrain to take over and just operate. Okay, so this is how, again, we just show up somewhere and you're like, what happened? How did I get here? When I was driving, I was just in a fog. That's the midbrain taking over. Or time just passes and you're not even sure what you're doing. Again, that's the midbrain. So that's what our brain is designed to do, and that's a good thing some of the time. But it can be a bad thing too. So let me give you a couple examples here just to show this a little bit more if I need to. So years ago, I was going for a run with several people in an area I didn't know, and we did this run over several days. Now, this run was 3 or 4 miles long. It was through a woods. There was a trail, and as we ran, and this is common if you've ever done physical exercise like this, your brain tends to shut down, and you're just focused on the physical activity, especially when it's tough. And so I ran this trail several days in a row, but as I ran it, I was with other people that knew the route, and I was just on autopilot. My brain totally was shut down. I'm just following these other people just to get done with that run. Well, toward the end of these few days, these other people wanted to time this race, and one of them was a marathon runner, so he took off. And I was just following the trail. Well, no big deal, right? Just follow the trail. But partway through this, I crossed a trail that I did not recognize. And I started thinking like, oh, did I get off somewhere? Did I take a wrong path up a ways, and now I'm on the wrong path? And so then my brain started engaging my frontal lobe and thinking like, man, maybe I am on the wrong path because I don't remember crossing this trail. And long story short, I wound up taking a different way, and instead of this 3 to 4 mile run, it turned into about a 7-mile run to get back, because lo and behold, those days prior, I did pass that trail, but I was on such autopilot that I never even noticed it. And then when I was alone, I had to operate more on conscious thinking, and I noticed it, and it kind of threw me off, right? So that's an example of how we can really easily get on autopilot. And sometimes it's a really good thing, because my body didn't want to think about what I was doing while I was running. It was putting all the energy toward finishing that task and running. So let's turn the corner now and talk about, well, how does this apply to hunting? And how does this apply to, the brain of someone that's just a really successful hunter? So a lot of times I've noticed that these midbrain activities or habits actually get passed down to us, and we just accept them. They kind of bypass the frontal lobe, and they go right to, if we hear them enough, they go right to the midbrain, become habit, unconscious stuff we just follow, and we aren't analyzing them with our frontal lobe and really saying, is this true or not? Is this correct or not in my situation? I just have accepted it, and now it's just a program in my unconscious midbrain that I just keep following. And I might not even know why I'm following it. It's just something I've accepted. Some of these are, and these are a little controversial, but sayings like, just play the wind, right? That's something that usually is taught to us. It makes sense in some ways, in a lot of ways, but then there are ways that actually it doesn't make sense when you start digging into it. Or the phrase that I love, just go with your gut when it comes to hunting decisions. These are things that get said over and over again. We don't analyze them with our frontal lobe. They just go over time just into a habit or something we just say or do. The question is, are they good or not, right? These are things that hunters maybe found out, they make a rule about, and they pass it down to other followers that just take it in without thinking about it, right? And that's easier, right? That's easier for me to not have to process. But the question is it correct or not? And this is key. It's only good if it is correct. But many times these can be bad and prevent us from actually critical thinking about our situations in our hunting, right? And when we don't critical think about our hunting, or when we are hunting, we can really make mistakes, and then we can continue them over and over. Think about this. If I have a habit that I've formed that's my body's just doing out of the midbrain there without critical thought, I'm going to just keep doing the wrong thing over and over and over again and get bad results because I've just accepted it. It is now a habit, and I'm not cognitively challenging it at all. And this is where a big buck slayer's brain is just different. Okay, so here is your high IQ moment. So if you find yourself going through the motions when hunting, as many of us do, what is a good way to get out of that rut and start critical thinking more often? And I've said this one before, but it really applies here really well. Well, a great way is to journal about your hunts. Answer simple questions on paper, and doing this makes your brain engaged and pulls you out of the midbrain fog and into the frontal cortex and the frontal lobe, where cognition and thought takes place. The big question that really gets this kick-started is the question, why? Why do I do this or that? Why did this work on this hunt? Why didn't this work on this hunt? That really kick-starts that process out. If you can start doing this, you will force yourself out of some of these bad habits and into more effective, good habits. It's a high IQ practice everyone should try. And do you know your Dear IQ? Do you think you're Dear Smart? Why don't you take the new Dear IQ test and find out? And guess what? This new assessment is designed to reveal those bad brain habits and behaviors, tell you specifically where you need to work, and get your brain to match that of a big buck slayer's. And if you can do that, you're going to see results. That's linked below and includes a free consultation with me to go over it and really see how you can best apply it. And I will say, new and experienced hunters alike will greatly benefit. All right, now let's get back to the podcast. Okay, so now let's get to what I observed in some of these lessons from this series and some of the guests. And what I observed about 3 ways these big buck slayers, their brains are just different, how they operate different, and how what we just learned applies to this. So the first thing I've noticed, and this isn't 100% of the time, but I've noticed it quite a bit, is that a lot of these guys that seem to be on the next level, they are self-taught. They didn't necessarily have a dad or a grandpa or somebody growing up that taught them this stuff. They kind of did it a lot on their own. And the interesting thing about that is they were able to, and I guess forced to, use their front brain more and really analyze things from experience and through thinking, not sayings or practices handed down that may have been incorrect. And sometimes, a lot of times, I think that does happen. So they were self-taught, and that really helped them to see things as they were, really come to creating better habits and the automaticity of their midbrain, these autopilot things that are based in reality and that really work and work well. And that allows bypassing of bad thinking, false narratives, or wives' tales that just aren't true. Example of this is Tony LaPratt. And talking to him, I'm pretty sure that's his story. He just started doing it, and he started learning things, and he started exploring and coming up with all this stuff that he now teaches is a result of that if someone just told him how to do it, it probably wouldn't have been that way with him. So if you were taught at a young age, that can be great, but it doesn't necessarily mean that some of those or all those things are true. It might increase the chance you're operating from midbrain behaviors that aren't correct or helping you. And so that's something to be aware of. The second thing I noticed about big buck slayers is that they engage the frontal lobe more often. They don't rely on that midbrain all the time like your brain wants to do. They challenge prevailing thoughts and paradigms often. And one way to do this, to make sure and force yourself, because it's not natural, right? We tend to fall back on midbrain habits. You have to force yourself into front brain thinking. So one way to do this and engage the frontal lobe that I mentioned was journaling. But a lot of these guys that I've noticed over the years are actually writers of some sort or teachers. Writers. Bill Winke has written a ton. John Eberhardt has written a lot, books and articles. I started by doing writing, and I've written for big magazines for 12 years now, and that really forces you to use that frontal lobe. A lot of them are teachers too. They might have a course, teach seminars, do workshops like Tony LaPratt, John Eberhardt, myself. A lot of examples of that, right? Again, it forces that frontal lobe to work. A good example of this from this series was Bill Winke, the interview with him when he's talking about camping under his tree stand, basically, and staying in the woods. And this is a simple thing, you might think, but it showed a willingness to unlearn and challenge the prevalent thought that you must come and go from your stand on each hunt. If you think about it, that is just kind of hardwired into everybody's brain because, well, it's just what everybody does. Right? And so we just accept it and we just keep doing it. The midbrain passed down this mentality. It just gets stuck in our brain. And over generations, we just do it and don't challenge this idea. And the third thing I've noticed that big buck slayers do and how their brains operate differently is they purposefully set their autopilots. that takes a lot of purpose. The unconscious is fed purposely with the correct things, not accidentally, to make the right habits. So they work at identifying the correct habits they want in there, and then they go about practicing them, so then they become ingrained and become habits, and they don't have to think about it at all. They know the power of setting correct systems and getting them in place, like a scent control system. At the beginning, when I started doing it, that was something that was a lot of work. I had to think about it a lot. I had to go through all these steps. That's a lot of work, right? But once you identify that this is the right way to go about it and know why that is, and then you start doing it, you start ingraining and creating those habits. It's not the natural thing to do, but once you choose it and then you start doing it, then you are programming your subconscious and making it a habit. And then it becomes much easier. And these hunters realize that, and they purposely set these systems in place and set their subconscious or their unconscious to working them and making them habits. So they're willing to do the hard work up front. They know it's hard work, but they purposely do those and then let those systems go to work for them, which is what they do once you get them set. An example is like a shot prep system. If you think about your archery, your shot, all the checks you go through, all the steps you go through as you are going to make a shot, if you thoughtfully go through those of how you do that, how you anchor, how you make sure you're on target, all those little things, how you release, your follow through, and then you start ingraining that every time, pretty soon that's habit and you're just doing it and it produces better shots, right? That's just one example of a system that could do that. And the good thing is that these are things everyone can consciously make a decision about and do. Sometimes they're tough, they require work, but you have to be willing to analyze, be wrong, maybe realize you were wrong in what you're doing, and retrain your brain. But they're definitely possible in what the brains of big buck slayers do. Okay, so here are your high IQ takeaways and challenges and the 2 free things I promised. Okay, first is our scent control regimen. That is a system that you can set in place that allows your midbrain, that unconscious operation of something that will really help you a lot. And so that's linked. That's a freebie. Check that out. It's a full list. It'll help you big time to get that in place and just make that a habit. And if you're really serious about this, the second thing is attending our advanced whitetail workshop this summer. It includes the new Deer IQ test and also will be an intense deep dive into basically rewiring our brains with the proper tools and mindsets to consistently take great whitetail. It's really a game changer, and I'm not just saying that. It'll be a great educational experience for those just starting or those that have been hunting a long time. And for a $100 off code, email me at adam@deeriq.com. We're only giving that out for the first 12 participants. But if you're really interested, you can get $100 off. Email me at adam@deeriq.com for that code. Okay, and next we're officially starting a new series on deer science. And this is going back to last year, a real popular series, but going even deeper into this, revealing what the science says and how it really applies to us as hunters to up our deer IQ. You won't want to miss it, and I'll see you then.